Hello, my name is Yago Rodriguez and we are here in the Museum of the Armored Forces of the Spaniard Army in Madrid. In this case, we are going to start up by speaking about the M-60 Patton. But let me tell you that in the future we will have other videos related to tanks, to anti-tank weapons, maybe we will have debates. But in any case, let's begin.
To talk about the history of this steel monster, we must go back to the end of the 40s, shortly after the World War II, as this is when the basis for the design of the M60 was laid. At that time, the US had three classes of tanks: the light ones armed with 76mm guns, such as the good old Sherman, the M24 or the Walker Bulldog; the medium tanks like the M47 and M48 Patton tanks armed with a 90mm gun, and the M103 armed with a powerful, heavy 120mm gun.
The origin of the Patton series can be traced back to the M26 Pershing. In this case, the evolution came with the M46 Patton, then the M47, then the M48, and finally the M60 Patton. But if there's one idea that I should tell you that is very important, is that there is not really that change between these models, but that this is a constant evolution. For example, we can find that the first M60s were closer to the M48 Patton than they were to the M60 A3 Patton, for example.
Now give me a second, this has been possible thanks to Steel Beasts, an awesome armored warfare simulator used in armies all over the world since a few decades ago. It is used to train the Leopard 2 crews of Spain, of Germany, so it is a very high quality one, right? If you are interested in it, you can get a 15% discount if you are among the first 100 buyers by using the next code, the code BLINDADO, which is appearing right now in your screen. I will let you all the links below.
As it can be noticed in the dimensions, the chassis of the Pershing and all of the Patton series is between 8.4 and 8.6 meters. And remember that this is in the part of the tank where all the elements of its motorization are located: fuel tanks, engine, transmission, suspension. In other words, most of the evolution of the Patton series can be traced back to the turret. The caliber of the barrel, the arrangement of the armor and the type of fire control system is where you can best appreciate how the armored warfare has changed since World War II.
Since the M26 Pershing, the dimensions of the chassis doesn't change until the introduction of the M1 Abrams, so all the Patton series have the same dimensions. This is due to production reasons, because in this case it is necessary to transport them with trains and ships, and so they were calculated these dimensions in order to be able to carry on that effort.
But the seed of the M60 was planted in 1956 during the revolts in Budapest, Hungary. At that time, the Red Army intervened militarily to end the rioters. While this happened, some rioters used cocktail Molotovs and managed to damage some tanks and make their crews flee. One of them, especially an advanced T-54, was driven by the protesters to the British embassy, where a military attaché was able to access the vehicle and find out highly valuable information.
So when the British military attaché was able to take a look at the T-54, a brief look, he could confirm two things. One, that the gun, the rifle gun, was of 100mm, well over the 90mm standard in NATO at that time. And second, that this new tank had around 200mm of armor around the turret, would make it almost impregnable to the NATO ammunition of that time. This led to the need to develop a new tank with a more powerful gun in order to deal with the Soviet Steel Beasts of the time.
So the Americans and the British started to cooperate. A big contest was organized in Aberdeen, where they tested 90, 105 and 120mm guns. Overall, it was the 105 T-254E2 prototype that offered the best performance, so it was decided to manufacture it in the United States, which was done under the name M68, the definitive gun of the M60 Patton. As the introduction of the new gun was a pressing need, some arrangements were made. For example, British 105 L7 guns were installed until the American steel mills learned to produce the M68. At that time it was thought that the Pattons needed to be better armed as a temporary solution because army planners expected that cooperation between the US and Germany would give birth to the tank that should be the definitive answer to the Warsaw Pact. From this need evolved the M-48 Patton, which gave rise to two new tanks. On the one hand, the M-48A5, destined for the export market, and on the other hand, the first M-60 Patton, which maintained a similar shape to the first one. It is interesting to notice the parallelism between the M-48 Patton and the Soviet T-54, as opposed to the Soviet T-62 and the M-60 Patton. The T-62 was also an enlarged version of its predecessor, the T-55, in order to install a much more powerful cannon as a temporary solution. In any case, the M68 did not just represent a step forward thanks to a bigger caliber and higher penetration values, but because it replaced the old mechanical firing pin by an easier to maintain electrical firing pin.
So some of you might notice that there is an iron cross in this M48 Patton, and this is not because this is a German one, but because this took part in the film of Patton, dedicated to General Patton and recorded in 1917. In this case, the Spaniard army provided with tanks to do the film, and in exchange Hollywood provided them with fuel in order to use the tanks. So one crewman from that moment told me that they got so much fuel, so much oil, that they were able to train more than any other unit in Spain and in Europe. So they told me like they were the best at the time. Of course, I'm not sure if that's true, but of course this story is quite curious.
Throughout the 60s, the first models of the M60 Patton were introduced. The original M60s still had a turret with a similar design to those of the M48 Patton. So it was actually from the M60A1 model that created the silhouette of the tank that is familiar to most of us. The M60s were first deployed during the terrible Vietnam War, but in this case the standard Patton was not deployed. What Americans used was the ABLB Bridge Legging variant and the M728 Combat Engineers version armed with a powerful 165mm short-range demolition gun.
So we got three different main variants of the Patton tank. One is the AOS, which means add-on stabilizer, which had of course a stabilizer. It had the new track T142, which was better than the previous one, but it really wasn't that good. And finally we have the top-loaded air cleaner compared to the later one, compared to the previous ones which were sided. In any case, the second version was the M60A1 Rise, which have some improvements in the engine that allowed it to have an easier maintenance. From the logistical point of view, that was quite better. And finally, we got the M60A1 Rise Passive, that had passive sights for the commander and the gunner, smoke dischargers, also the new M240 machine gun, and of course the infrared light for the driver.
From the point of view of tactical mobility, the M48 had notable deficiencies, especially due to its gasoline engine that consumed too much. So it was decided to install the Continental AVDS 1790 air-cooled V12 engine, capable of dealing with various kinds of fuels, but mainly thought to run its 750 horsepower machine by diesel. But even adding those two fuel tanks that carried 1,400 liters of fuel, the range of the M60 kept at a relatively low 300 kilometers in road. But as the time went by, the Patton evolved. A new T142 track was added to the A1 models, as the previous one gave problems and the pins sometimes came out. Plus, stabilization was added to them from 1972, allowing for shooting in motion. These M60s were called AOS, or add-on stabilization. But the Patton had a problem. Its engine, not only it was very fuel intensive, but it was also maintenance intensive, and the first Pattons tended to drown because the dust quickly saturated the filters. All this led the Americans to incorporate some improvements on the engine in order to gain time between engine failure. That's why the Pattons with this engine are known as RISE, and they are more logistics friendly. For instance, during tests accomplished during 1980, comparing overhauled M-60A1s to newly produced M-60A1s RISE, the US Army found that the A1s had a mean miles between failure of just 59 miles, approximately 108 kilometers, while the RISE had it at 114 miles, that is 180 kilometers. Finally, remember that the air for the engine was usually took through the top of the turret to the engine, because there the air was cleaner, while the air filters were used in circumstances where that wasn't possible.
So some of you might be thinking, what's the main difference between the M60A1 Patton RISE passive and the M60A3 Patton? So there aren't that much differences. Mainly I would say that the wind sensor at the top of the turret, and also mainly the most obvious one is the thermal sleeve on the gun that allows it to have an homogeneous temperature all along the gun, which doesn't reduce the precision in case of firing. In this case also the M60A3 Patton has the capability to produce smoke, which I'm not absolutely sure if the M60A1 RISE passive can. And what's the difference between the M60A3 Patton and the M60A3 TTS tank thermal sight Patton? Well, really there isn't that much difference. Mainly I would say that the thermal sight is slightly better in the M60A3 TTS.
Since 1978, the Patton has benefited from some modernization packages. For example, the reactive armor that the Marines added to their M60 during the Gulf War, and which today is used by Morocco, the ones used in Yemen, or the various Israeli variants, namely Sabra and Magak, that have been deployed by Turkey to fight Daesh or by Israel during its own wars. In Spain, the Les Patton served until a few years ago as the Iron Fist of the Spaniard naval infantry, the older naval infantry in the world, but today they are restored in reserve.
Okay, so I hope that you have enjoyed this video on the Patton series. The next one will be about the fire control system, the armor, and all those little things that make tanks what they are and not just the mere picture. Also, let me tell you that if you come to the capital of Spain, Madrid, you should come to the MUMA, that is MUMA, which is the Armored Forces Museum. It's inside an armored force base, and it is very interesting. Also, if you come, don't forget to let some money to make a donation in order to allow them to maintain all of these awesome pieces of history. Anyway, thank you for staying there. Hope you can tell me anything wrong I said or anything to improve in the future in the comments. So that's it. Thank you very much for everything, and see you in the next video.